of people of African descent and the link between memory, geopolitics, and legacies of French and British colonialism. Professor Otele has been the recipient of several national and international research grants. She's also a regular contributor to the press, to television and radio programs. Her latest books include a monograph, African, European, and Untold History, which has very recently just come out. So it's sort of fresh off the press, and I would urge everyone to get a copy because it's a dazzling history of African Europeans that reveals old and diverse links between Europe and Africa. And she's also very recently, again, in this year itself, released an edited volume entitled Post-Conflict Memorialization, Missing Memorials, Absent Bodies, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan. Our second speaker today is Professor Hakim Adi, who is Professor of the History of Africa and the African Diaspora at the University of Chichester. He was a founding member in 1991 of the Black and Asian Studies Association, BASA, which he has also chaired for several years. Professor Adi's 2013 book, Pan-Africanism and Communism, looks at the Communist International and its activities in Africa and amongst the African diaspora, while his book on Pan-Africanism, A History, is the very first survey of the Pan-African movement. Professor Adi is an advocate of the education curriculum in the UK, both at secondary school and at higher education levels, being changed to reflect the history of Africa and the African diaspora, including the contribution of African people to world history. He also leads the History Matters group, which is a collection of academics and teachers concerned with the underrepresentation of students and teachers of African and Caribbean heritage, within the history discipline. His latest book is an edited volume, which is entitled Black British History, New Perspectives, which provides a fascinating collection of historical studies on the Black British experience. So just a thing on the format, we're going to begin with Professor Adi. So we're going alphabetically. And each of the speakers are going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, up to an hour, up to half an hour on the history of Black Lives Matter. After that, we're going to open it up for discussion. And we very much hope to make this sort of a dialogical conversation with all of you who are here. So you can then sort of jump in with your questions and we'll sort of open it up for about an hour after that. So I'm just we're just waiting to see whether Tim's message can be loaded. I should say that Tim Hitchens was our president of Wolfson College, wasn't able to make it today because we actually have governing body starting in a few minutes.
I'm Tim Hitchens, the president of the college.
Sadly couldn't be in two places
thank
at
you
the same
for
time.
joining us at this month's
president of the
Black History Month. I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'm afraid we have a governing body fellow meeting at the moment. So today we're looking at the question of Black Lives Matter, the historical context of Britain. And let me introduce the panel to you. We have Professor Olivette Otele, Professor of the History of Slavery at Bristol University and Vice President of the Royal Historical Society. And she's also Chair of Bristol's Race Equality Commission. So welcome, Professor Otele. And also Professor Hakim Adi, who's Professor of History of Africa and the African Diaspora at Chichester University. And so now I'm going to hand over to Professor Nayanika Mathur of Wolfson College for what I hope will be an excellent debate. I hope you have a good evening.
Okay, so thank you, Tim, in the virtual world. As I said, sadly, he couldn't be here today, but it's absolutely wonderful to have the two of you here. Thank you so much for being here. I'd also like to really quickly thank the Wolfson Welfare Group, especially Fahad Rahman, who've actually organized this. And this is part of many endeavors within our college, which is a really international graduate college, to actually really consider Black History Month very seriously. And I'm really grateful to them for actually organizing this entire event. So should I hand over to you, Professor Adi, to begin perhaps?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the welcome. I'm going to try to share my screen. So let's just see how that works. See the screen and not me.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is just to present a historical outline as best I can in 25 minutes or thereabouts. And it's difficult to know where to start because the history of the struggle for the recognition that all lives matter and that Black lives matter no less than any other life has a very, very long history in Britain. I'm going to start in the late 18th century with Olivette Otele, who you will hopefully be familiar with, who was one of those who both wrote about the problem of, or the issue of Black Lives Matter as it manifested itself at that time. Of course, at that time, the main question was that of human trafficking and enslavement, not just in the colonies, but in Britain itself. And he was one of those who organized at that time both to free his colleagues, his compatriots from enslavement, but also organized more broadly against human trafficking, and you could say in defense of the rights of Africans, and indeed in defense of the rights of all. And I'm going to come back and maybe say something more about him a little bit later. But I think the main point I wanted to make is that the assault on Black lives, we can see existing in that time in the 18th century when Britain was the world's leading human trafficker, and the business of Britain was human trafficking. And so many of the problems that we face today, we can see originating in that period, in fact, even before that period. But as I say, because of time, I'm beginning my survey in the late 18th century. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the 20th century to make things easier. And one of the characteristics of this struggle to defend the rights of all, to defend the rights of Africans and those of African descent in particular, in opposition to slavery, to colonialism, to all forms of racism and Eurocentrism, we can see kind of ushering in the 20th century, because in 1897, the African Association was formed in London. It's generally thought of as being led by this gentleman, Henry Sylvester Williams. It was actually initiated and inspired by an African woman called Alice Kinloch, but it was concerned with the rights of Africans in Britain as well as globally, and was the, we can say, the movement which, or the organization which ushered in the modern Pan-Africanism. So this concern, as I said, with the rights of Africans, opposing racism, has an extremely long history, which we can go into in more detail later. One of the problems which existed in the early 20th century was that, perhaps just as today, there were various forms of racism which existed. Some of them related to the fact that Britain was the world's leading colonial power, that Africans, those in the Caribbean as well as those in Asia, were considered lesser human beings, incapable of governing themselves, and with other inferior characteristics compared to Europeans. So we can say that racism was a state-organized institution, if you like. And from the period, in fact, even before the First World War, but certainly after the Second World War, the state, the various governments of the day, introduced legislation to give sanction to that racism, to make racism official. Of course, there were other actors, other players in developing that racism, which kind of became endemic to British society. And in this early period, we find that some trade union leaders, particularly what became the National Union of Seamen, also had a policy which openly discriminated against some workers, particularly those workers from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. And that the combination of these different forms of racism contributed to the riots which broke out in 1919 in about 9 towns and cities throughout Britain. Here you can see pictured the riot in Cardiff, but there were also similar disturbances in London, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Glasgow, in Hull, and in other places. So this was you can say, a state-led racism, but as I say, with other key organized institutions and so on involved. And this form of racism continued throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. In fact, laws were introduced, like the Coloured Alien Seamen's Order, which was introduced in 1925, the British Shipping Assistance Act, which was introduced in 1935, which openly discriminated against what today would be called people of colour. So one of the consequences of that was that those who were here had to organise themselves. And numerous organisations developed in the 1920s and 1930s. I'm just going to mention one, the League of Coloured Peoples, which was specifically set up in 1931 to deal with the problems of racism which operated at that time. Of course, the discrimination against seafarers and workers was just one form, because in this period in Britain, racism was legal. That is to say, it wasn't illegal. There was something called the colour bar, which meant that people of colour, people of African, Caribbean, Asian heritage could be and were prevented from getting accommodation, having rooms in hotels, being served in pubs. There was discrimination in the army, in employment, essentially in all walks of life in Britain. So organisations like the League of Coloured Peoples were established to fight against these many forms of racism, as well as to take up the other problems of the day, such as colonial rule and so on. Well, if we go to the 1940s, and I'm just picking isolated incidents to illustrate this history, even during the war, Second World War, ostensibly a fought against fascism, the ideologies of racism and so on, we find the colour bar operating in the armed services and in the auxiliary services like the Land Army. And this is a very famous case from those years, from 1943, of a woman called Amelia King, who was actually born in East London, whose brother and father were in the Merchant Navy, but she was barred from joining the Land Army. And it became a kind of cause célèbre at that period. The poster here also mentions another well-known case at that time, the famous cricketer and Colonial Office employee Louis Constantine, who was also barred from a hotel in central London at that time. So even during the war, these problems existed. And I'm just giving a snapshot because you could write a whole book on racism and the struggle against it during the period of the Second World War. Well, after the war, we have the famous Pan-African Congress held in 1945, and it was just one of the organized forms of opposition to the colour bar. In fact, the opening session of that Congress was devoted to the problem of the colour bar in Britain. And of course, there were numerous organizations involved in organizing that Congress that all had their own experience of racism, the question of the rights of Black people in Britain, and brought that to the Congress, and obviously spoke about it and tried to deal with it in numerous other ways outside the Congress. Then if we move on to 1948, which is usually spoken of at the time of the arrival of the Windrush, and without going into this in great detail, because people probably know the story fairly well by now, the arrival of the Windrush was greeted by government circles with some alarm. Clearly, those who came from the Caribbean in this period, some of whom were ex-servicemen, were not invited to come. And the government, the Colonial Office, the other government departments did everything they could to prevent the Windrush arriving, if you like. They hoped that they could persuade it to go elsewhere. They made various plans to make those who'd come unwelcome and make it difficult for them, to prevent others from coming, and so on. So if you like, this hostile environment, which we're familiar with today, existed in the 1940s, well, in fact, existed in the 1920s, 1930s, and even before. So it's nothing new. And here we actually see a picture of the arrivals being told various things about, you know, life is not going to be simple here in Britain, and you'd be much better advised to go home, and so on, which again we can go into later if people want to know more. Well, 1948 is interesting. I haven't got photos of everything that happened, but 1948 was also the occasion for a major, as it was called at the time, race riot, a major racist attack which took place in Liverpool during that period. It's also the time when there was a breach in the colour bar. This is a guy known as Dick Turpin. He's one of three boxing brothers. And he was the first black British fighter to compete for a British title, and that was in 1948. Before that time, no person who was not of pure European descent could fight for a British title. So the colour bar in boxing was breached in 1948. In other areas of society, it continued for many years. Well, in this period of migration, there were, of course, numerous problems. I mentioned the colour bar in employment, in accommodation, and so on. And so in this period, too, we find organizations emerging to combat it. And this is one of them, which was based in Birmingham, the Afro-Caribbean organization. It was led by the gentleman on the right, a man called Henry Gunter, who was a communist who based himself in Birmingham and campaigned for many years to break down all the discrimination that existed at that time. Well, again, if we go to the late 1950s, of course, we have the period again of these organized racist attacks of Notting Hill, and in 1959 of the murder of Kelso Cochrane. Again, we see here, this is a demonstration in Downing Street, people organize themselves. Of course, in Notting Hill in 1958, people fought back. They formed organizations of various kinds. That was also the case in 1959, and a whole range of organizations were set up. Various measures were taken by people, including the organization, the first Caribbean Carnival by Claudia Jones in that year. So this history of fighting back and organizing against the various manifestations of racism and discrimination, again, has a very, very long history. And then if we go forward to 1962, we have the first post-war Immigration Act, which was, again, an openly racist act, which in a way exacerbated the problems facing those of African, Caribbean, and South Asian descent in Britain. And you could say the latest Windrush scandal is linked to the introduction of these immigration acts from 1962 onwards. Then, of course, there's the later acts, 68 Act, 71 Act, which again one could go into, but they were openly racist. They kind of gave succor to those who were demanding keep Britain white. They gave added powers to the government to deport people. They encouraged the what we can say the racist and biased activities of the police and so on, which again we could go into in much more detail. This demonstration is led by Claudia Jones, who you see on the left of this picture here in London. Well, I'm moving on quickly to the 70s, and the Oval Four is now quite a celebrated campaign. This is from 1972. And it was very, very typical of that period when there was an openly racist campaign in the press and media about what were referred to as black muggers, meaning street criminals. And this allowed the police to arrest people with impunity, and in fact, not only to arrest people, just to beat people up. And the Oval 4 was a celebrated case of that time, when these 4 young men were attacked by the police who were in plain clothes as they came out of Oval Tube Station. They defended themselves. As you see, some of them received long jail sentences, or 2 years is long enough. One of those gentlemen a defense campaign was organized by organizations like the Black Liberation Front, which was established in the early 1970s, to take up, again, these questions of racism, of Black Lives Matter, of colonial questions, and so on, which are all interrelated. Here's Winston. This picture was taken a couple of years ago. If you remember last year's press, you'll know that he finally got his conviction overturned after nearly 50 years of having a criminal record and of spending time in prison. The conviction was totally quashed because it was established that the police were corrupt, and particularly the particular police officer who led the attack and who fabricated evidence and so on. And in fact, this policeman was so corrupt that he actually ended up in prison himself. But anyway, that's another story. So Winston fought with others for nearly 50 years to clear his name and clear the name of the other, his 3 friends who were also involved. Well, then if we move on to the 1980s, I mean, and this is actually a demonstration. I was there. I don't think you can see me in this photo, but I was there. This is from 1981, from March 1981. And this is the famous Black People's Day of Action, which was organized at that time in response to the New Cross fire, where 13 young people were killed in a suspicious fire. And the suspicion at the time was that a house had been firebombed and they were killed and so on. The key thing about it is that, I mean, today it would be a kind of national news and there'd be letters of condolence and all that kind of thing. In that period, nothing was said. There was no official response. There was no government response. There was no response from the Queen and so on. So this demonstration, although it was about the 13 young people, was a wider kind of demonstration and campaign against racism in defense of Black lives and so on, as it existed at that time. And of course, there were lots of things going on at that time, which I don't have time to talk about now. But it was a very, very important demonstration. And again, illustrates the history of this movement, if you like, and the importance of people organizing themselves. Well, then if we can move on to the 1980s. This is 1985. Cherry Gross, who was shot by the police. There were, in fact, a number of cases during this period. She was paralyzed for life, and this shooting led to her early death or premature death. If we move on to the early 1990s, 1993, Joy Gardner, who was arrested by police immigration officials and killed by being gagged. And though she said she couldn't breathe, they allowed her to die. And it became, again, a very important case in this time, the early 1990s. Then if we go on, again in the same year, we have the perhaps very well-known murder of Stephen Lawrence. Now, the key thing here is not just that those who were openly organized as racists carried out this murder, but it was the fact that the police were incapable of doing anything about it or bringing anyone to justice. Not only that, but the police actually spied on the family and had their agents infiltrating the family and its circles and so on and so forth. This case eventually led to the Macpherson report some years later, which, as you may recall, gave state sanction to the idea of institutionalized racism and said that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist. Some people see that as a landmark, but as everyone will be aware, it hasn't really made any difference. Well, then moving on to more recent times, this is to 2010, and this is my friend and her son, Adi Taylor on the right, her son Sheni Lewis on the left, who was killed by police in hospital in 2010. Again, it's one of many murders by the police, by the state in this country, which has gone has not been dealt with. No one has been brought to book. He admitted himself to hospital, suffering from anxiety, some emotional problems or mental problems. The police were called and they killed him in hospital. That's 10 years ago. I remember the funeral. It was only yesterday. But as I say, Sheni is just one of many people who've been killed in police custody. And, you know, I'll have to say great respect to Adi, who's continued to campaign. As recently, obviously, in the recent upsurge events, was on television talking about what had happened with great courage. Well, then we come to the exposure of the Windrush scandal following yet another Immigration Act, the 2014 Act, or the 2014 and 2016 Acts, which again were openly racist. And of course, at the same time, there was the development of what Theresa May, as Home Secretary, called a hostile environment. As I tried to demonstrate, this hostile environment wasn't a new thing, but it was developed in such a way as to target particular types of citizens, if you like, and with the results that we're all aware of. Again, I think what's important about this is the fact that it's state organized. It's organized by the Home Office. It's not as if it was a negligence or a mistake was made. This was a organized policy to target certain types of citizens, and with the results that we're all aware of. And then to bring us right up to date, again, we have the most recent upsurge, the Black Lives Matter upsurge, which, as everybody knows, has had, if you like, is a reflection of multiple concerns. The way the police act with impunity, the way government acts with impunity, the fact that there's the glorification of racism, the glorification of those who've carried out crimes against humanity of various kinds, including human trafficking and so on. And as you will have seen in the news in the last 2 weeks, in spite of this great upsurge, the government and its supporters are now pushing back on all these questions, whether it's questions of statues and the glorification of criminals, whether it's what is taught in schools. There is a kind of major offensive, or maybe counter-offensive is the right word. So we have a very, very long history of these problems, these concerns, and we have a very long history of people organizing against them, of people expressing their views very forcibly, of which the toppling of this statue is a very good example. And I think, if you like, that is the way forward. To go back to Equiano in the 18th century, one of the characteristics of Equiano and his colleagues was that they organized themselves. They didn't just organize themselves as Africans, they organized themselves alongside everybody else who was struggling for change and for the rights of of all human beings. And I think that is the characteristic also of the BLM movement this year, that from Land's End to John O'Groats, people have voiced their concerns and so on. What all of these things demonstrate is that we live in a society which, although it proclaims itself democratic, none of us have decision-making powers. And it makes us, or should make us, realize that to deal with these problems of racism, of Eurocentrism, of problems of education, of problems, all the myriad problems which have been expressed this year, the question of decision-making, of who makes the decisions, what decisions are made, and in whose interest these decisions are made, plays a very, or assumes a very central position. So for me, discussion on how that decision-making system can be changed is key to dealing with all of these problems related to Black Lives Matter, racism, Eurocentrism, and so on. I think my 30 minutes is up, so I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Adi. That was brilliant. This was a fantastic sort of tour, really quick history of Black Lives Matter here. Thank you so much. I think we'll have some questions, but I think we can come to that perhaps in the Q&A. So, Professor Otele, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you. Hakim's presentation leads me very nicely, it's not the word, but leads me to the present matter. I'm not going to share my screen, but I prepared a text just for myself because I'm getting old and I have a hard time organizing my thought if it's not written. So it's just for me. I just, well, thank you for inviting me. And it is a privilege for me to share this platform with Hakim, because he has been working on these questions for a very long time. And, the question of education is key to what I'm going to talk about, really. I don't want to give an overview about the US because, you can find the information quite easily. I'm more interested in what is happening within British institutions. They really are struggling to acknowledge the stark racial inequalities that are endemic in our society. And so I'm going to move from the individual, the personal, the local, the national. And I would like to start by talking a bit about the nature of the work I was hired to do at the University of Bristol in January. So I was appointed to look at the links the University of Bristol has with the slave trade and slavery. And the university was set up after the abolition of slavery, the abolition 1833. But a number of buildings are named after people who are involved in the slave trade, and some of them financially supported University College, that later became the University of Bristol in 1909. So the most well-known of these buildings is the Wills Memorials building, and that building was donated by the family, the Wills family, to the university. I don't want to dwell on slave traders, but just for your information, the Wills family made their fortune through tobacco, therefore, coming from North America, therefore, through products, commodities produced by enslaved people. So it's not so much about the wills that I'm interested to talk about tonight. It's to do with the context of my appointment. So prior to my arrival in the city of Bristol has really been at war with itself over the questions of the legacies of the past, but more importantly, and that is often put at the back of discussions, over the place of minority ethnic people, and in particular people of African descent, in places of power, or rather their absence in positions of influence in the city. In 2016, Marvin Rees, who's of dual heritage, became the mayor of Bristol. In 2018, you have Cleo Lake, who became Lord Mayor of Bristol, the first Black woman to become Lord Mayor in the, of Bristol. She identifies as a Black person. So Bristol, however, you know, these are just few dots here and there, because Bristol has been and is still the most segregated, one of the most segregated cities in the country. You know, numerous reports written about it. Runnymede Trust is one of them. So when we talk about segregation, we talk about racial, geographically, it's true. We talk about racial segregation, unfair distribution of wealth, and they really go together, as we know. So we know that racial inequality has an impact on social mobility and on education. And speaking about education, just to give you an idea, in 2018, out of the 1,346 teachers in the city, only 26 of them were Black. Bristol is by no means a unique example. It is, however, interesting to look at it because it is your typical, vibrant, wonderfully diverse city that has a reputation of being at the forefront of liberal ideas and art, of course. After all, you know, the iconic band Massive Attack and the graffiti artist Banksy are all children of Bristol. Well, at the core of these inequalities, though, in Bristol and in the rest of the country, are forms of various racism, and I'll talk about racisms. These are reproduced and perpetuated in all walks of life. Worst of all, that history and the legacy of the past, racism is one of them, is not taught in school at all. In fact, there is resistance, as we have seen on the news and recently, but it's not a recent phenomenon, actually. Resistance to link past and present. People like to isolate. The statue was removed because of Colston, but nothing else is looked at around the specific context. There's also this belief that you can sell the idea of multicultural or culturally diversity without acknowledging that there is racism. In other words, you can't be culturally diverse and be racist. Well, yes, one can be just that, and it's really what has been happening in the country. And you see, because we can't acknowledge these things, racism has been mutating and hiding behind or living within several institutions. So let's remember how, just to bring some memories to the surface. Let's remember how many people felt when artist Dave released his song "Black is Beautiful." Just black is beautiful. Why do we still need to have or to use the motto that was vastly used by the civil rights movement during the civil rights movement in 21st century Britain? Why do we still think that why do we, actually see people having a knee-jerk reaction when you say Black Lives Matter? Even after the execution, the film execution, the lynching of a man, even after the killing of Black people in various areas. Another example, the country went into meltdown when rap artist Stormzy said that Britain was a racist country. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that each one of you sitting there listening, going on about your life, trying to make things better is a racist. What it does mean, though, is that racism is systemic, institutionalized, as Hakim just showed, and has been for a very long time, protected within institutions. And let's make no mistake, it's not a faceless, racism is not faceless, institutionalized racism is not faceless. It is about processes such as the functioning, making, procedures of hiring committees and individuals with some power who are still upholding or protecting those who are racist. It's not, this is very important because it is actually enough to delay and destroy the work that some of you are trying to do. We've all have heard this term, oh, it's just a few bad apples. But then again, if we do not question those who are discriminating, then one is an accomplice. We all become accomplice. We're all familiar as well with the phrase, silence gives consent, aren't we? So I really can't bear the idea that one can just face these instances of racism, hear about them and not do anything, and just shake one's head and silently disapprove because one becomes an accomplice. That is why we need to challenge institutions, not just on what they are doing to stop racism, but actually look at what they're presenting as results. What are results? What a successful fight against racism looks like within institutions? What are they promoting? One of the key points, of course, is the workforce. Saying we're doing good is not enough. Hiring people of African descent, of Asian descent, at all levels within these institutions, for me, is one of the many, steps towards fighting racism. I talked about institutions. Let me go into the nasty details. I want to start with an incident that happened back in December last year, 22nd of December to be precise, and that made the news. And the news has picked it up more recently, but that incident had been circulating online on social media for months. But Newsnight and BBC News picked it up yesterday. One night on the 22nd of December 2019, 3 British Somali women had gone out for a night out. They came back close to the flat of one of them. They went to a corner shop to buy some snacks, and they were verbally abused by 2 white women. When they tried to leave, they were attacked, beaten, unconscious, dragged on the floor, and so on. The attack was referred to the police, of course, and the problem is that they did not try to have the CCTV footage at the time. And by the time they did, the attack had been, the recording had been erased with new recordings as is usually the case. So the file was closed in April this year. And now the victims have been accusing the police of discrimination because the way the police questioned them raised serious questions, actually. But they only reopened the dossier, if you would, just after the Newsnight's program. And the Met has apologized for the way the whole thing was conducted and for neglect. Apologies, of course, are not enough. Why am I telling you this story? It is classified as a racist incident, a hate crime. And incidents are often seen as, anecdotal. But this one, like many others, is endemic. It reveals processes of violence, of course, and erasure of Black pain or attempt to suppress it. But it's also about institutionalized racism. It's what institutionalized racism looks like. It's not faceless. Many of you may think that this is just not another unfortunate example. I want to put a few things into perspective through figures for you. And these figures are coming from the UK government website. So between April 2018 and March 2019, there were 600,000 roughly people arrested. Black people were and still are 3 times more likely to be arrested than white people. There were 32 arrests. Okay, just let's look at the figures now closely. There were 32 arrests for every 1,000 Black people and 10 arrests for every 1,000 white people. Another one, Black men are more likely 3 times, likely to be arrested 3 times, more likely to be arrested 3 times over white people, white men. So another figure, 60 arrests for every 1,000 Black men and 17 arrests for every 1,000 white men. The conclusions could be, well, it means, and I have heard that before, it means that Black people are offending more. But I'm going to put another figure to you. At the end of March 2019, and the figures haven't changed much since, 93.1% of police officers were from white ethnic group. 93%. Now, does it mean that if you completely change the police force ethnicity, there will be less racism. There might be, but let's also remember that minority ethnic people can become the hand of the white supremacist institution. So how do we change this state of affairs? Training in diversity only is not enough. We know that. In other words, inviting Black people to talk to the police during Black History Month won't end racism. Some people have put forward the idea of abolishing the police in the US. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about this. For Britain, diversifying the workforce, in my view, from top to bottom, is essential. Teaching the histories of the past, not just a small number, but including them, these stories of resilience, liberation that Hakim has been presenting you, collaborations into the curricula is essential. Engaging with the history of activism is I think, a good way, a wonderful way actually, to showcase collaborations between people from various backgrounds, but also demonstrate what is possible when working together. It's not just about the police. Various areas need urgent attention. The LAMY review, for example, has recommendations, and those recommendations were not followed. It's only last week or 2 weeks ago. It's only 2 weeks ago, I think, that I found out when David Lammy came to Bristol that Bristol is the only city that actually is implementing the recommendation. And the LAMY review was about the criminal justice system. It was not just that there was an overrepresentation of Black men in prisons. It was also about the anomalies of sentencing, the lack of data collections on ethnicity and religion, the fact that many young offenders had been groomed at a very young age and were at the mercy of criminal gangs. Poverty and fear played a part in those grooming processes. There was another thing that was interesting and still interesting, is that white-collar criminals were not much more likely to get away with their activities. And those activities are the ones that have led to the rise of Black gangs in the country. I could go on and on about many other institutions. We have the data. We have solid research done for many decades. What we don't see is the changes being made, because at the core of this, it's about a minority, people of African descent, for example, who are the most affected. So you see, the mindset that I see in keeping the status quo is, for me, is another form of racism. Racism is on a spectrum, you know. Finally, for now, because there's so much more that needs to be done, I think remembering that it is, of course, about class, economic power. It is, of course, about heritage, people of African descent, for example, but it's also about gender and sexuality, sexual orientation. Black, disabled, LGBTQ communities are even more affected and discriminated against. So when fighting for equality, let's remember that liberation can only achieve if we all achieve it, and if we all have a fair chance at what is open to the majority group in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was really fantastic. I really like the way you sort of began with this micro history of Bristol and then moved into much wider concerns, Professor Otele. I can see that there are already some sort of questions coming in, but perhaps before we sort of open it up to everybody, if I could just kick off the discussion with something that sort of struck me in both your talks. In a way, both of you were talking about the prevalence of institutional racism, and you both talked about what happens when you name that. So you mentioned the Stormzy event, Professor Otele, about how that created this huge ruckus just because he stated a fact, frankly. Professor Hakim, you sort of mentioned how that particular report that came out, which said after the murder of Stephen Lawrence that the police is institutionally racist, that the naming of it was important, but you also sort of said, but has it made any difference? Because we can see the continuation of the same kinds of institutional racism. I guess my question, in a way, which I think is also quite important to this whole discussion of Black Lives Matter and Black History Month, is exactly as both of you said, we know that there is deep racism in the UK. We experience it in very different ways all the time, and we have the figures, we have the history, we have the, we have these horrific events of murders, or assaults, of violence. We have the statistics that you just read out. We have the material, but there's still. So I guess the two questions. One is that why is there still a sort of hesitation to more publicly acknowledge this discourse that there is intense racism in Britain? And secondly, what are the limits of even naming something as racist now, or pointing out the fact that, for instance, the university is institutionally racist, or the police as a structure is institutionally racist?
Hakim, do you want to go for it?
Thank you. I'm trying to understand the question. See, what are the limitations of calling something racist?
I think my question, so I think my question really is picks up from something you said as an aside, Professor Adi. The question is that why, firstly, why is there still reluctance, despite the presence of a lot of facts and figures and stories and histories and events, in the wider public discourse in Britain, to accept the fact that there is a huge prevalence of racism, and that there's something like institutional racism that we encounter in our everyday institutions, whether it is, the health services or universities or the police, or the state in a way is institutionally racist. So why is there this reluctance to more publicly acknowledge it outside discussions like, say, the one we're having here? And secondly, following on from that, what are the limits of being able to name something or an institution as institutionally racist? Why is, you said that isn't enough, and I'd like to know a bit more about that.
Well, I think I would say the first thing is I'm not sure that your first assertion or premise is correct.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing about the Black Lives Matter movement here is it shows the kind of depth of public opposition to racism,
right?
Literally from John O'Groats to Land's End.
Mm-hmm.
People were protesting in places where there aren't even places.
That's right.
Where there are like three people, there were two of them were protesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, in general, people in Britain are opposed to racism. There's no doubt about that. But the powers that be are not. And if you look at the recent events that I mentioned, the debates in Parliament, etc., everything is done to claim that there isn't any racism, that there is no problem, etc., or that, and this is, historically also been the case. You can pick any example. When you go back to, Kelso Cochrane's murder in 1959, the police said it wasn't racist, and in fact, in that time, there wasn't even such a thing, an accepted concept almost of racism. So the difference between people's experience and what is widely known to exist, and the powers that be that refuse to accept that these things exist and refuse to do anything meaningful about it. And I mean, that relates to the kind of society that we live in, which doesn't favor the majority of people and their interests. It doesn't matter whether it's COVID or it's racism or it's the inequalities of wealth or it's kids having food to eat. The powers that be are not interested. If they're not interested in kids eating, how are they going to be interested in racism? They're not going to be. And so if we go back far enough, we see that it's the powers that be which are the main source of this racism. It's governments that pass immigration laws. It's governments which organize the police. It's governments which say that some people don't have British citizenship and we're going to deport them. It's governments which preside over colonial systems which are racist. It's governments which organize human trafficking on a global scale. And those governments represent certain interests who benefit from those activities and those actions. And those interests also have, you could say, gained some benefit, or even from racism itself, and from the divisions which it creates in society. And also from the fact that some people, the rights of some people are denied, and therefore the rights of all are more easily denied. So we live in that kind of society which doesn't favor our interests, the interests of the majority of people. So, you know, the answer is very simple if one looks at it in that sense. You know, we need a different kind of society, and we need different institutions and different types of governance, if you like, which reflects the interests of the majority of people, because that is when these things are going to be dealt with. And it wouldn't matter what problem we looked at, you know, that would be the solution to it. I don't know for how many years people have been talking about the police, going back to 1919, at least, if not beyond. People have been saying there's a problem. Initially, government said, no, there isn't any problem. The police are wonderful. Then after about 70 years, they said, well, hang on, there's a few bad apples. Then they said, okay, well, there's institutional racism. But it doesn't make any difference, because as the example that Olivette's just given, the police act in the same way. In Stephen Lawrence's case, they acted in the same way. In Sheni Lewis's case, they acted in the same way. You know, they are the source of the problem. That's not, as individual human beings, they might be wonderful, but as a force, as an institution, they operate in certain ways, and that way in which they've operated hasn't changed. So the question is how to deal with that problem. And of course, people protest and organize themselves, as I've shown throughout history, and that's extremely important. But it only becomes, you know, really, really important when you can actually change things, so that, as I said, the decision-making power is in a different place. You know, decisions are made by the majority of us. We have a police force which represents the majority of us. We have a government which represents the majority of us. In those circumstances, then there's the possibility of meaningful change. I think history shows that without that, of course, change is possible. There are these differences. We don't live in the 1960s anymore, or even the 1990s anymore, but the essence of the problems are the same. The inequalities which exist are essentially the same. And in terms of economic inequalities, they're actually growing wider. You know, Britain is more unequal now than it was 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40. So for me, that's a very key question. I'm an educated person. I want to be able to make decisions about the society that I live in. At the moment, I don't have that ability. And so I'm in a position of, yes, protesting, organizing, whatever. But I'm getting old. I don't want to be doing that for the rest of my life. So having that decision-making power in our hands, to me, is absolutely key consideration.
Thank you. Professor Otele, did you have any thoughts on that?
I would add that I agree with Hakim that majority of people are not, you know, racist. You know, it's not the vast majority of them, but the vast majority of people don't take things into their own hands. They chose, and then we go back to what he just said. They chose to elect people who are going to talk for them, so they don't have to think about certain issues. And then they elect people who are the most vocal, the most this and that, but who actually are removing power from them And this is the tragedy of this. This is what makes me the most angry, is the fact that, you know, we're talking about poverty, deep-seated poverty that is growing, and yet people have voted for governments on and on who will implement measures that make them poorer. And I can't accept that. But I also have a degree of, you know, there's some hope for me. The hope is to see many, I keep saying this because it's true, but then again, I'm a teacher, so perhaps the students are not representing the vast majority of the world, or the society, but students, this generation, 2020 people are incredible. 2020 people just question everything. They question me and my methods of fighting. They question me of my demonstration. They question people before us. I don't necessarily agree with how they do things, but many of them are not ready to accept what has been in place so far. So yeah, I have hope in that sense, I think.
Great. Thank you. I can see we're getting quite a few questions. So I don't know if you saw the one which has just popped up on the screen from Alex D, who's asking, why is it those governments are voted in and allowed to continue despite institutional racism?
Why? But people, exactly what I just said, people, when they vote, for those who vote, when they vote, it seems that the most incredible fallacy is the manifesto and the campaign. I've seen that during the Brexit debate, but I also seen that during election. People are so desperate to listen to whatever fantasy they're being promised that they don't actually look at the details. When some government tells you that, you know, it's the immigrants' fault, I mean, we've been there. Surely that should, you know, be a clear warning sign that they're not addressing the main issue, you know, not the main issue, but they're not addressing other issues, the issue of poverty, when they're deflecting constantly. These are signs, so, and yet people are voting for them. So I think a political literacy, perhaps for me, it's key. It doesn't mean that, you know, once you have political literacy, you're less racist, but at least you know what you're voting for. You know that it's not just about racism, it's about your own rights as a citizen that would be kind of diminished, and the question that matter to you, that won't be looked at. Yeah.
Sadi, do you have any thoughts on why racism?
Well, I think the difficulty is that you know, we have a political system where you don't have any choice.
Yeah,
that's the problem. The contrick of the system is that you're presented with, you can either be shot or you can be hanged. Which would you rather be? And some people vote to be shot. Some people vote to be hanged. But so this is the problem, that we have a political system which, in fact, nobody's voted for the political system. That's the first thing to say. But secondly, many people don't vote. And the majority of people definitely don't vote for the government, whichever government it is. And so this is a problem. We don't have a political system which, again, represents our interests. In fact, if you look at the history of the political system, it wasn't designed to represent our interests. You know, it was instituted at a time when people didn't even have the vote. So that is a problem. It's not democratic. It presents an illusion of so-called representative democracy, but it doesn't give us any decision-making power. So you can vote as much as you like. It doesn't really make any difference. So I think that's really the issue. It's not so much that people vote or don't vote, but that the powers that be are still the powers that be. And in fact, whichever government's in power, more or less the same things occur. In the 1960s, just to give an example, the it was a Conservative government that introduced the 1962 Immigration Act. The Labour Party, while it was in opposition, said it was going to repeal it. As soon as the Labour Party came to power, they introduced the new Immigration Act, which was even more racist than the previous one. Anyway, I could go through all that history, which is people probably know from their own experience. So voting for one of these parties doesn't solve any of these problems. It doesn't narrow the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It doesn't deal with problems of racism. It doesn't deal with Britain interfering in other countries or whatever. These are not, and they're not going to deal with these issues. That remains a question of who has power in the country. And people might disagree about who they think has power. But one thing we can all agree on, we don't have it. We don't have any power in the political system as it exists to make decisions. And that's what needs to be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question from Fahad. Fahad, do you want to just ask it? I think you can sort of jump up and ask it, right? Yeah. You're on mute. You're muted, Fahad, sorry. I think you can unmute yourself. We can't hear you. There's a... Oh.
Hello.
Hi, yes.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. This was so interesting. I learned a lot and lots to think about. The question that was popping in my mind about racist and institutional racism, the difference between that and the fact that most people are not racist, as you've been pointing out, but it's more about systemic, the way institutions are set up. One of my previous colleges in Cambridge, they hired a professor, not a professor actually, a research associate who published many articles, sometimes in open source journals, sometimes in conferences, which took data and in a pseudoscientific way discussed, intelligence and how there are race-based population differences in intelligence, and also a lot of statements about statistically if there are more colored people or Muslims, there's going to be more crime in an area. So how do we, first of all, develop the skills to understand when data is being manipulated, when science is being manipulated, and when the media and all over the difference between truth and misinformation is very blurry? How do we appraise the difference between data being used for racism, and how do we challenge it?
I would start by saying that this idea of science and intelligence, it's a long history, it has a long history. So actually learning about their history, you would understand that this is just a continuation of an old discussion that has gone nowhere. So the new data, the new thing, and the new research and the publication, it's a lot of noise on a topic that is linked to ideology and white supremacy. And I keep thinking that every time I've seen that, I think I know who it is you're talking about. Every time I see that, I keep being appalled by the poor level of, it's just poor. It's not manipulation of data. It lacks rigor, and it's just so offensively mediocre that I keep being so astonished that people would listen to these people. So again, I think when you're in position of power, when you do that, and you're in a non-Russell group somewhere in, let's say, West Wales, you're less likely to be listened to than when you're in Cambridge and you're talking a lot of nonsense. So it's about position of power, and yeah, anywhere you can be, if you're at the top-ish or so-called the top, and you have a platform, people will listen to you, and no matter what you say, it will come out as something valuable when actually it isn't. I know my answer is yeah, mediocrity just gets me. Sorry.
I mean, if we look at history, back in the day, I remember in the 70s, students wouldn't allow such people to write this nonsense. People like Isink, who was around, and I think even the National Union of Students denied him a platform. He was being promoted at the time, and these people are promoted every now and again. And there was such a protest from students that these people disappeared. Probably nobody's heard of Isink today, which is a good thing. But as Olivette says, people have been making these assertions for hundreds of years. You know, I started up with Equiano. That's what Equiano was writing about. That's one of the reasons why he wrote his book, to show that Africans were, you know, no different from Europeans and so on. Anyway, so to be having even a discussion, as Olivette says, this is a waste of time. Who wants to even discuss it? It's just something you find. Unfortunately, it's no longer on paper, because in the old days you could rip it up and throw it in the bin. Whereas nowadays it's probably circulating on the internet or something. But people should protest about these things. You know, after the Second World War, all kind of laws were passed against these kind of things, because people are just given their lives in their millions fighting a war against these kind of people. And today, here we are at Oxford, and people want to discuss it. Why do we want to discuss it? This is just nonsense. As I say, people have given their lives to rid us of this nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there other questions? I can't see any in the chat, but does anybody else want to sort of jump up and join in? Yes, please. Yeah. We can't see you. Okay, it's connecting.
It's gone.
It's connecting.
I saw a question pop up and then it disappeared.
Really? Okay. How do we account for BLM in context of the political black, which literally included all the non-whites as a category, which emerged in the 70s and 80s in the UK? Should we wait to see whether Narendra is able to ask the question?
Hakim, did you see it?
I saw it, yeah. Did you not see it?
Something about political black.
Yeah, there it is again.
It's there again. How do we account for BLM in context of the political black as a category which emerged in 70s, 80s in the UK? I think it's trying to connect us to Narendra, but
yeah, I see.
Do either of you want to take the question, because I think the connection is not happening?
This is more your area, Hakim, but I'm gonna have a shot at it, because I just feel that political black in the 70s, 80s had its life and it's died at its death. People, people are challenging certain things, and they are linked. For example, the term BAME is being challenged because it doesn't represent the full experience and history of, let's say, people of African descent, and grouping them into BAME is not accepted. So political black is even larger in terms of grouping and adding people to the fight. It did have serve the purpose of bringing people together, but I think that, nowadays it really isn't to me, it's not appropriate. Black Lives Matter was born out of the lynching, the execution of people of African descent, Black people. So this is why it focused on Black lives as such. Even if, as I have said in Carmarthenshire, Black Lives Matter is mainly made of white people. But, this is the beauty of it. It's that they're interpreting what it means that Black lives do matter. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the questioner is right. In the 70s, in fact, in the 60s, there were a number of organizations or coalitions formed between people of Caribbean origin, African origin, Asian origin, and of course others. And in that sense, the struggle against racism, even going back to the 18th century, is a struggle, is everybody's struggle. It's not one section of the population struggles against racism. Racism is an attack on everybody and everybody's rights, and should be opposed by everybody. Obviously, the terms that people use to describe people of African origin or Caribbean origin or Asian origin has changed over time. In the 1940s, people were called colonials, and people were called coloured. And then this is almost the equivalent of BAME today, which is a kind of catch-all expression meaning non-whites, as the apartheid people used to say. So obviously people kind of object to these kinds of terms, and people always want self-definition, which is, as things should be. However, and as Olivette says, Black Lives Matter arose in very particular circumstances in the US, and then it developed globally, including here and so on. But of course, that doesn't mean that it is, or the struggle against racism is exclusive or excludes anybody. As I say, it's important that everybody is united in that fight, whether people are Asian or whatever. So this is just a historic moment when particular issues are being aired, and the issues which have come up are things about Eurocentrism in education, which again affects everybody. Nobody should be excluded from history, for example, or from any study of human life, human society, human history, and so on. Nobody should be nobody's life should be thought as being less important than anybody else's life. That's the essence of this movement, I think. And it's, as I say, manifested itself in a particular way. But as far as I can see, it's not excluding anybody. What is important is, particularly in the areas of education, but in all areas, we fight for everybody's rights, because these rights are interconnected. And I started off with talking about Equiano. Equiano was also a member of the London Corresponding Society, which based itself on that principle that if you fight for the rights of Africans, then you should also fight for the rights of working people in Britain. If you fight for the rights of working people in Britain, you should also fight for the rights of Africans. So you fight for the rights of everybody, the rights of all. So I think that's extremely important, and everyone should fight. Everybody should struggle over these things. That's the crucial thing, I think.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question from YouTube, which Fahad has put up in the group chat, I think. And the question from YouTube is, do you think BLM in the UK should look different and have different aims than BLM in the United States? So we don't know who this person is. It's as you know, this is being streamed live on YouTube as well. So, it's a really interesting question on BLM.
I think it's already different. It does already, it has different different histories, experiences, and different approach. So, what is interesting to me is to see how Black Lives Matter is being interpreted and is being supported or is supporting various movements across Europe. Because in France, it has another ring to it, another experience. But at the core is the fight against racial inequality and the fight against racism and fight against white supremacy, fight against social inequality as well. These are the core, but ultimately the experience of each group or each community completely shapes that movement. I read, I think, was it 2 days ago, the Black Lives Matter UK was changing its name. So already we're seeing a shift in many ways in the approach.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what are the aims of Black Lives Matter? It's not as if it's codified. There's even one organization. There is, as Olivette says, there is a move to establish an organization, but for very particular purposes, I understand, some of which are financial. But everybody is shaping this movement, and the stands that it's taken have been against racism, against Eurocentrism in education, against the glorification of human trafficking, colonialism, racism, and so on. So who wouldn't support that? It's only the government that doesn't support it.
Sadly, yeah.
Well, sadly. Not unexpectedly.
Not unexpectedly, yeah, not very surprisingly. There's a question that Fahad asked again, and I think this is specifically directed to you, Professor Hakim Adi. He's saying, can we hear a bit more about the context of the New Cross fire affair that you had mentioned? And Fahad wants to know, how was it related to race?
Okay, well, the New Cross fire occurred in the beginning of 1981. Mm-hmm. It was a party in New Cross, a birthday party of young people. I can't remember, like teenagers, and it was a house party and so on. So, a fire started. Excuse me. The allegation at the time was it was a petrol bomb. That was never established, but there was a history in that period of petrol bombing of houses. That was the kind of activity that the fascists carried out. They petrol bomb houses, they petrol bomb mosques, they petrol bomb shops, and so on. So that was the allegation. And in that fire, however it started, 13 young people, I think almost all of them, if not all of them, of Caribbean heritage, mainly teenagers, died in that fire. The issue about it was, what was the response of the powers that be? So the police, the basic police approach essentially was that there was no evidence that it was a racist attack, firstly. And secondly, to question those people who'd been at that party as if they had been responsible and so on. So that created a lot of anger and resentment that people who were essentially the victims of that terrible tragedy, one of the enormous tragedy, were being dealt with in that way. The second thing, and perhaps more telling about that period, was there was no official response to those 13 young people being killed. I mean, it was like a national tragedy. Normally, if it happened today, you would expect the Prime Minister would make a statement. The Queen would send a letter of condolence to the family, or there would be at least some official response to it. In 1981, there was nothing. There was no official response. What made it worse was that I think some weeks later, as far as I can remember, there was a fire in Dublin, where again I can't quite remember now. People were injured and killed. the Queen sent a letter of condolences to Ireland, which, if people don't know, is not part of Britain anymore. It's a foreign country. But in London, nothing was said. So it created like outrage, both because people thought it was a racist attack that the police weren't dealing with. This is a time when police didn't even necessarily accept that racist attacks occurred. So that wasn't particularly unusual, but people were outraged about that. Secondly, the fact that the powers that be completely ignored it created, as I say, outrage. And so there was this mass demonstration, which was unprecedented in that period, of people not demanding necessarily, but protesting. And that's the things that people shouted: 13 dead and nothing said. And, you know, people demanded justice in the, you know, general sense of that term, not anything. So it was a protest which came out of that particular incident, that tragic incident, but also the whole decade before, if you like, the 1970s, of what had gone on, how people had been treated in this country, the racism of the police, the racism of the powers that be, the way just people, young people, were treated. And I mentioned the example of the Oval 4. That was typical. Being beaten up, attacked and beaten up by the police was not unusual. It was not unusual because there was a campaign in the press: young black men are muggers, are street criminals. Therefore, the police should go out and arrest them. And that's what happened. If you walking along the street, the police would stop you, just like you have stop and search now. In those days, you had this whole idea of mugging. The police had special units, a special patrol group that went around arresting people. Anyway, one could go through all these incidents. And of course, there was racism in education and in other employment and all kinds of other problems at that time. But racism wasn't recognized, wasn't acknowledged by the state, by the powers that be. So the New Cross demonstration, the Black People's Day of Action, grew out of a specific incident, but it reflected much wider problems. And in fact, only a few weeks after that, the uprising occurred in Brixton, literally a few weeks after. So again, which was a response to essentially a police attack on the people of Brixton. So those were those times when these uprisings occurred, not just in London, but in other cities, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Bristol. Yeah, in Bristol. I remember going to Bristol actually at that time of the uprising in 1980. So these were the times that we went through back in the day. And anyway, hopefully that explains a bit about what was going on.
Yeah, thank you. That makes it much clearer. Unless Professor Otele wants to add something to this, we have 2 raised hands, and Fahad's going to put them on stage. So I think we have Leslie.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Professor Hakim and Professor Olivette. I'm really grateful for the things that you shared today. I just wanted to ask a question about how we can encourage more Black young people to become teachers. I know Professor Olivette was talking a lot about employment at all stages and so forth, but in a sense where, you know, sometimes their experiences at school might be quite challenging. How do we encourage young Black people to take the step into the education field?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Thank you. I'm going to take the example of Bristol, simply because some things are happening, not just in Bristol, but in many cities, where we found that at a very young age, we can start influencing the way influence the curriculum at a local level. There are initiatives. One of them is called One Bristol Curriculum, because the mayor, and again, it comes to the top, the mayor has decided that we're going to have a one city approach, which means that acknowledges that racism is present throughout various institutions across the city. So it can't be just the education in a silo, but also mental health, but also the police, but also, and what has been decided well with many other institutions is that you look at the way the curriculum is shaped, but at the same time, you put in place practical measures to more or less force institutions in an academy to hire Black teachers, because that's the only way you're going to change your curriculum and encourage young people to consider, because we know that many of us, most of us actually, we function also for role models. You become, they say, you're most likely to become the person you see in front of you. So more Black teachers, more likely to encourage kids to consider education. But at the present time, for me, I don't believe in encouraging, because we're past, goodwill. It has to be something that forces certain institutions or hold them accountable to make meaningful changes. Otherwise, they won't do it because it's comfortable not to. So it means basically at university, for example, level, how many Black and minority ethnic teacher training programs, or rather in your cohort, how many of them are of minority ethnic groups? What are you doing to actually integrate people living, for example, in Bristol, who never go to the big University of Bristol, but elsewhere to become teachers? What is it what are the measures? When I mean by what are the measures, it also means what kind of bursaries, scholarship do we put in place specifically for them? So it has to be we have to go into details. So in other words, just expecting them to change is not going to happen. Holding them, putting pressure, accountable, that's for me the only way, really. Yeah,
absolutely right, I think. And I think it's a very, very good question. It's a very, in a way, it's a very difficult question to answer, because I say that as a failed teacher, because I had started off my career trying to become a school teacher. And I failed. I didn't succeed. I had to become a professor instead, as a substitute, as it were. Very difficult to become a teacher. So, and it's still very difficult to become a teacher. And I don't know about teachers in general, but just looking at history teachers, which we did some work on, we found that, in fact, that's why we started the History Matters group in whenever it was, 2014, because there was a headline in the Times Educational Supplement that the previous year there'd only been 3 Black people who were training to be history teachers. Then we did some investigation. We found that out of 16,000 plus history teachers in the country, only 220 something were of African or Caribbean heritage. So why is that? So then we looked into why that might be. And we found, well, actually, there are not very many people actually studying history at university of African and Caribbean background. And why is that? Well, we looked and we found that at school, not many people do even GCSEs. And of those who do GCSEs and get good grades, not very many go on and do A-level history. And of those who do A-level history and get good grades, not very many go on to university. So why is that? So we held a whole conference, which I and Olivette and others organized, and to look for the answers. And anyway, there are many answers, but the main answer is the problem of the Eurocentrism of the curriculum. That young people are actually put off studying history because they say it doesn't talk about people like them. And so they don't study it. And so they don't go to university to study it. So they don't become teachers. And so the cycle just continues and continues. So how to break that cycle is very, is difficult, and it needs to be done on multiple levels. We started the Young Historians Project to encourage young people of African and Caribbean heritage to engage with history, to produce their own documentaries, which has been very, very successful. But that's just one initiative. You know, as Olivette says, there's a question of what is taught in schools. There's a question of what is examined. You know, now we've managed to get an exam which deals with the whole question of migration and the characteristics of Britain in history. That took us many years. Changing the curriculum, I don't know when we started that. I was involved in that like 30 years ago. We're still talking about it now. So that shows how difficult it is to change the curriculum, to change the textbooks, to change the exams, to change not only who is taught in teacher training, but what are they taught? Because the problem is just in history that people are taught all kinds of funny things in teacher training colleges. And so then they teach those funny things. So breaking that cycle has to be done on kind of multiple levels, in multiple ways, in all kinds of institutions. And I guess the key thing is not to accept the status quo. The status quo is wrong, doesn't favor our interests, and we have to find, you know, all the ways of changing it. And again, to come back to my original point, the key thing is, who are the decision makers? Who decides what is going to be taught? Who decides what kind of education system there is? Who decides how it's funded? Who decides all these things about education in general in this country? And it's not us. It's people like Michael Gove. Remember him? Michael Gove said he wanted to have a history curriculum which is only white men and property. They're the only people in history. So if you have such people, how do we solve this problem with these kind of people around? We're only by getting rid of a system which allows such people to be decision makers. Can we really, of course, one has to struggle on all these fronts, but in the end, it comes down to how do we become the decision makers, as with everything.
Well, thank you for that. So we have another person who has the hand up, and Fahad is just going to put them up on the screen. So it's Maribel.
Hello.
Hiya.
Yeah, hi. I'm Maribel. I'm the BAME rep in Wolfson. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was very interesting, and I think everybody has enjoyed it quite a lot. We had a smaller panel discussion last week with 3 interesting people, all of them somehow involved in, you know, supporting the Black community in the UK. And one of them was Simpiwe. She's a leader of the Rhodes Must Fall movement here in Oxford. And so I asked her why it is so hard in, you know, a university or an environment like Wolfson, where I can feel the positive energy and the, you know, longing for change. Why is it still so hard to see changes, and why does it take so long? Or, you know, and she said that it's also a part of these, you know, big institutions like the university, that we have quite a fast turnover rate in terms of, you know, students that want to be active. For example, people who are doing a master's, maybe 1 to 2 years, people who are doing postgraduate studies, maybe a little longer. But I thought it seemed reasonable to me that this is a problem for, you know, us getting involved, then, you know, leaving again. And what are we leaving behind? So when you said, when you talked about the history of protests, I was also thinking, if it's not being taught in school, what has already happened, it's really hard for me, you know, to know and to understand where we're at the moment. And so my question is basically, what can we do to ensure that everything that has been done, all the hard work that has gone into protest and, you know, the movement, how can we ensure that it's not lost once we leave the stage again, moving on to something else?
Well, it's anyway, very pleased to meet you. I think the key thing is not to move on to something else. but to keep struggling for what you're struggling for. You know, if you're struggling for example, for a change in the education system, you shouldn't stop struggling for it when you leave Oxford. You should keep struggling for it. I'm not at Oxford. I'm struggling and have been for like whatever long it is, 40 years or something. So you have to keep, you know, you have to keep going. And I mean, the other key thing is to be organized and to create organizations or mechanisms which carry on that struggle in different ways, wherever it is. They don't have to be Oxford based, they can be Britain based, or I think that's very important. So people may come or go, but the organization, the mechanism, the whatever it is, keeps going and keeps fighting and adapts to different conditions and so on. And then there's also the question of you know, what one is fighting for, and to, you know, be clear of what your objectives are, and the fact that, in my view, fighting for changes in education or whatever are linked to these other struggles and other changes that we require, which is you know, all about our decision-making power or lack of decision-making power. So our disempowerment and our need to empower ourselves. So I think, anyway, to have a clear focus and to keep on, you know, because if you give up, then you don't achieve anything. But if you keep going, then, and you build and you involve other people all the time, then there's great possibilities of changing things. But the key is the struggle. You know, Frederick Douglass said, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. And he was definitely right. So to keep at it.
I would like to add to this, because that made me smile all the way, simply for two reasons. The first one is, the historian is, well, you need to document it. You need to make the struggle available to people. And so Hakim talks about an organization. This is the place where you do that. That's a very good place, where you keep the young kind of recruit active and informed. And the second point is that it relates directly to my position, because just a couple of, as soon as I was appointed at the university, kind of 2 months later, a whole bunch of students demanded to senior management that they explain the reasons, the kind of work I was going to do and all that. Now, these students have been at the forefront of the fight, demanding to have somebody like me who would actually take on that research. So they, through the activism, staff, but mostly student activism, the university decided to set up a post. Then now they hired me. 2 months later, students are demanding that they make things clear and public. What am I going to do so that we start on a good base? COVID happened. We decided to do something in September. Couldn't do it in September. You know what? Just a few days ago, students demanded that university did what they did, what they promised to do, which is to organize that big thing. So end of November, we'll have a big, which is becoming bigger and bigger because it's going to be across the city, public debate about my role within that research. But you know what is interesting? Is that none of the students who wrote to the Vice Chancellor are at university anymore. These are students from 3 years ago. So they did not just stop because they stopped being at the university. They kept at it. It's extraordinary, but this is how it should be.
Yeah. Definitely right. I think the other thing, just to add, which I kind of forgot part of the question, of course, that we historians, we have also a great responsibility to present this history. There was a question earlier which related to the whole question of disinformation. I can't quite remember what the question was, but anyway, there's no doubt that there's a massive like state organized effort, not only this state but other states as well, to spread disinformation about everything, and particularly to spread disinformation about history. You know, I said, what's her name? Kemi Badenoch, the minister who spoke the other day, said that the history of whatever she said, the history of black people in Britain is not the history of police racism or something. Well, of course it isn't. It isn't only the history of police racism, but if you remove the history of police racism, it would be a very odd history. So, you know, we have to tell the truth about the past, which is the struggles, but is also the crimes that are committed, and without kind of fear or favor. That's very, very important. So yes, document everything, to present history and to present the lessons of history so that we can all learn those lessons is very, very important. And that's, of course, it's not only the responsibility of historians, but for all of us to, especially in this kind of setting, to kind of struggle for enlightenment and against obscurantism and disinformation and all these things which are, you know, kind of having a comeback, as we heard earlier. All kind of nonsense is having a comeback. So one has to struggle against that for enlightenment, for, you know, a all-round presentation of things. Yeah, that's very, very important.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for just one last question, which we got from YouTube, if that's okay, for the two of you. It actually refers to something that Professor Otele mentioned in her talk. Someone called C. Jones has asked whether we can pick up this conversation on the abolition of police in the United States. And they're asking, I wonder if either of you could speak a bit about this and your opinions on it, if this is something that we should be calling for in the United Kingdom as well.
I'm the one who asked you the question. I said I would be interested in having your views on that. I think, you know, I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. I know people in the States who feel strongly about this because they consider that, some of them at least consider that the police has been the hand of white supremacist institution and government, and the police can never completely be for the people and protecting the people, simply because it was set up in a very specific context, the context of oppression, the context of repression. And therefore, it's not, you know, when they're carrying out those killings, or when they're getting away with doing things, we can't expect them to do anything different, because this is what they were set up to do. You know, I'm kind of poorly representing some of these views, but for some of them, this is the main point. Should we wish that for Britain? I don't know the answer to this. I really don't know the answer to this, because I still believe that there should be somewhere, somehow, maybe it's not called the police force, whatever you call it, there should be people who are there to protect us, not to kill us. You know, paying taxes for them to protect us. And they're killing us. And for me, I can never reconcile with this, that my money is being used for that. My hard-earned money is being used for that. So yeah, I don't have a definite answer on how to proceed, but it's something I feel strongly about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the US, it's a particular demand linked to the way police are funded at state level and city level and so on, which is a bit different in this country. But I think if I can say this, I think the principle behind it, or the logic of it, is that you know, the police must be answerable to the people, and must and the people must have some say in how the police operate and what happens, how they're funded, and all this kind of thing. So again, it relates to this question of empowerment, of decision-making power, and who has it. And I think in this country, obviously, it's not just a question of the police are just one aspect of the state apparatus, if I can use that expression. There's the whole judicial system, for example. There's the laws which are passed, which are openly racist and, discriminate against people who are declared immigrants or are falsely declared immigrants or are presented as, second-class citizens or whatever it is. So there's a whole apparatus of which operates in this country, which would need to be, you could say, needs to be changed. And what we're really envisaging is a completely different society, where people have a different role in decision making and governance and empowerment and so on. Therefore, you'd have a different kind of police, a different kind of judicial system, a different kind of prison system, a different kind of education system, a different health system, a different foreign policy, a different, because none of these things are satisfactory, and all of them are interconnected because they're part of one system which doesn't put us at the center, where the objects, or where the victims of that system, if you want to look at it like that. And that's what needs to be changed. We're in the 21st century. We have a political system that's been around for since the late 17th century. It's nearly 400 years. And it's not fit for purpose. It doesn't cater for our needs, So the thing is, what is the alternative? To be thinking about alternatives. And what's positive about defunding the police, you could say, is that people are thinking, let's think about an alternative. What should that alternative be? And I think to keep thinking along those lines about, what is it? What would be in our interests? What would serve the interests of the majority of people to deal with various problems and so on and so forth? And then, of course, we also have to think about, why do these problems arise? Why do we need protecting? Who from? What? Those are also the questions that need to be asked about issues of, crime and so on. Because you might ask, who are really the criminals? Are the criminals, somebody who goes and shoplifts? Or are the criminals those who are sitting in some plush office exploiting people and getting millions of... Anyway, that is the system, isn't it? It allows the criminals at the top. The criminals at the top are actually running the system. And they're labeling the people at the bottom the criminals. So those things need to be, looked at as well, those great inequalities and how they're produced. Why is there inequality? This is these things that people who are in universities are supposed to be explaining to the rest of the world. Why is it that everybody works, everybody produces value, but some people accumulate all this value, and the rest of us who produce it get almost nothing? And then we're told that, we can't afford this in the health service, or we can't afford whatever it's called, PPEs, we haven't got enough money, or we can't have this, or we can't have that, or we can't have meals for kids at school, we don't have enough money. How is that possible in the 21st century? In the world's, the world's 5th biggest economy? There's billions of money swilling around, and we can't afford for kids to have. So to my mind, all of these things need to be questioned, because they're all interrelated. And, a change has, as the song says, a change has got to come.
I think that's the perfect sentence to end it on. The change is going to come. Thank you so much, Professor Hakim Adi, Professor Olivette Otele, for these incredibly powerful and moving talks, as well as your very generous engagement with the questions that have cropped up. Thank you so much for everyone who took part in this, for all the students who were here, for everyone who's on this sort of YouTube channel, as well as on this particular platform, participating, asking questions, etc. It was really wonderful. Thank you again to the Wolfson Welfare Office, especially Fahad, for like sort of manning this whole thing and putting it all together. I really wish these were different times and we could sort of all go off together and go to hall and have dinner together now. But in any case, perhaps hopefully in the future, we'll be able to do that. And thank you again so much for being here and coming, so to say, to Wolfson College and helping us think a bit more deeply and critically about Black History Month and about BLM in the UK right now. Extremely grateful to both of you.
You're very welcome. Anytime.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much.
Soon. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.